Welcome. Let's get into it.
After my rock and roll stay in Canada, I had learned to love rock and roll. The Beatles and the Kinks and the Rolling Stones and all that sort of thing. Mamas and the Papas, and the Doors. I had learned to really like these groups because I felt they were doing something musically fly. And they would even do some Motown songs, rearrange them, and they would be fly. And I never, ever, ever in my life ever felt that I had a voice commendable to Motown artists. A lot of Motown artists actually scared me from pursuing singing. Even Holland, Dozier, and Holland, who were just writers, sang great. Okay? I mean, they sang their asses off. Mickey Stevenson, who wrote a lot of things, man. Hank Crosby, who wrote Sign, Seal, and Deliver with Stevie and all this stuff. My Cherie Amour. I mean, all these people could sing their asses off. Shorty Long, and Function at the Junction. Here Come the Judge. I was really intimidated. So, my concentration wasn't so much on my singing, but I was playing a little acoustic, a little bit of piano. I was a drummer, and that was it. I hadn't really got into bass. But I never had a teacher when I did fuck with it. I learned myself. I learned on my own. So I was very simple. There was nothing complex about my bass playing. With melodies. I was very much like McCartney. I mean, I play on very melodic bass.
Like that. Y'all like that. So just play the bridge and let me try and see if this works. 1, 2. Drums 2. 1, 2, 3.
All right, let's get into it. Glow, the autobiography of Rick James, written by David Ritz. We've been looking at David Ritz because David Ritz is obviously aware of the occult and supernatural side of the music business, and he leaves hints in his writings. So we are on the chapter called Spice. Spice. Summer of '69 was all about blood, sweat, and tears. Spinning Wheel. That song had me spinning. I was back in L.A. giving the wheel another spin while remembering that only a couple years ago, David Clayton Thomas, the Blood, Sweat, and Tears singer, had been playing the same club circuit as me in Toronto. If David could do it, why not me? I arrived back in California with Greg Reeves, a bass player who'd been mentioned by the great James Jamerson. My notion was that I could front a group with Greg, a white boy who could bring the funk, and call it Salt and Pepper, corralling that crossover audience Norman Whitfield had talked about. My first move was to approach Motown, but Whit's warning proved accurate. Not only couldn't I get to Barry, I couldn't get to the assistant of Barry's assistant. Ironically, the first connection I made was a Berry Gordy nemesis, Eddie Singleton. According to Eddie, who had spotted my talent back in Detroit, his career as a music producer had been stymied ever since he married Berry Gordy's former wife, Ray Noma. "You can stay at my place in the Hollywood Hills," said Eddie. Cool. Turned out Eddie's brother booked the talent for the dating game, so you can imagine the beautiful bees running through there I found. I found myself back in the showbiz circuit, where I met two wonderful women. Pam Louise, a tall black model, and Nancy LaVisca, a fun and foxy white chick. Pam considered herself a witch. Pam considered herself a witch. That's why we read these. Pam considered herself a witch, and Nancy saw herself as a free spirit. Same thing. Same thing. I loved them both. I bet you did. They became my tripping partners and lovers. So he's having sex with and doing drugs with witches. I ran back and forth between the two of them. If they minded sharing my love, their protests were mild. I would have not minded a menage a trois, but unfortunately that never happened. It was a period when free love was flowing in many directions. Another irony was that while Berry Gordy gave me no attention, he wound up lavishing, he wound up lavishing attention on Nancy, the witch, a lovely lady, and together they had a son. Ow! Wait a minute. No, Pam was the witch, okay. Nancy LaVisca is the fun and foxy white chick that Barry Gordy got a son with. Didn't know that. All right. Go ahead. Tell it, Rick. Pam was deep into tarot cards and astrological projections. I was deep into acid and orgies. In the midst of the sexual madness, Salt and Pepper was born. We found a manager, a gay boy from Beverly Hills, with taste and money. And we found a groove, but never an audience or a big label deal. The excitement of sex and drugs overwhelmed my career ambition, at least for the moment. Then something else happened that in this world of multiple partners, I hadn't expected. I fell in love. It happened at a wild party where I was looking for lust, not love. Romance was the last thing on my mind, and yet there she was, seated in a chair, a portrait in quiet femininity, her eyes catching the moonlight shining down from the skylight above her while she's at this wild party too. Wink. Our eyes locked for a long, long time. When we spoke, it was brief, just a few words. It was one of those moments when words were beside the point. Our hearts did the speaking. Later that night, we made love in the literal sense. The act itself created a deep, loving feeling. We went way beyond lust to something mystical. Her name was Seville, like the car. Her name was Seville Morgan, and she became my first live-in lover. We set up house in an apartment on Alta Loma with high wooden beams and a heated pool. I was living the life. But the life cost money. And because Greg Reeves had moved in with us and slept on the couch, the food bill alone was considerable. Salt and Pepper was gone. For a minute, I had a group called Heaven and Earth that RCA Canada thought might work. They put a single out, but the single flopped. My musical income was zilch. I was living on love and the generosity of my white rock and roll friends. Understandably, that generosity had run its course. And then another friend appeared. "What's happening, Rick?" I looked up from my stool at Duke's coffee shop on Sunset and saw Jay Sebring standing over me. My first reaction was that he'd be pissed. I had taken his money and blew it in Canada, where I wound up in jail. I had also messed with his girl, Perfect. "Hey, Jay," I said. "Where you been hiding?" There wasn't anger in his voice, just genuine curiosity. "I've been back for a while. I never knew what happened to you in Toronto." "Perfect didn't tell you." "Perfect disappeared. Tell me the story." I told him, and amazingly, he wasn't at all pissed. He was understanding. Jay was a jewel. You had to love the guy. "What a lousy break," he said. "I hope things have gotten better for you since you've gotten back." "Got an apartment with a cool chick, but right now I'm tapped out." "Right now I'm flush. Let me give you a couple of grand to get you back on your feet." Wow. What can I say? You don't have to say a thing. When you blow up, just get me front row seats to all your concerts. Every single one. With a big smile on his face, Jay handed me the bread. What a guy. His faith in me was a beautiful reminder that the glow was still there. Friends who'd become stars were all around me. I figured that it was a matter of time. Meanwhile, I had a little bread to buy a little weed and chill with my woman Seville, who turned out to have chops in the kitchen that rivaled her skills in bed. Greg and I spent lots of time figuring out a new musical direction that combined white rock and black funk. 2 new albums really got to us: Poco's Picking Up the Pieces and Crosby, Stills and Nash. Nash? one of the many aliases for the adversary, Nashville. I knew all those. Also busted a hip move with those thick harmonies. When Marrakesh Express hit, I felt happy for the guys. Before I knew it, they'd become one of the biggest bands in the world. I was buzzed when Fury called to invite me to a Poco gig at the Troubadour. Backstage, I ran into Steven Stills. Big hugs. Hey, Ricky, you gotta come up to my new crib. I bought it from Torque. Our mutual friend, Peter Torque, was one of the monkeys. Hey, hey, we're the monkeys. Those monkeys. Naturally, I never pass up a chance to hang with Stills and see his new pad. So Seville, Greg, and Greg's old lady went up there with me. Good vibes, good smoke, good times. Good to be back in touch with Stills and all the other CIA operatives implanted inside the music business. I mean, the monkeys. Anyway, you could do me a favor, said Steven. Name it, man, and you got it. Bruce is in bad shape. Palmer? I asked. Yeah, he sounds great on your record, I said. Since then, it's been downhill. I think it's hard drugs. Bruce Palmer is one of the best bass players ever, and I hate to see him that way, especially since we got this huge Woodstock gig coming. Before that, we're doing the Greek with Joni opening it for us, Joni Mitchell. Bruce has got to get himself together before all this happens. What can I do? I asked. Talk to him, Ricky. He loves you. He respects you. You're his man. Where's he living these days? Up in Topanga? I'll do what I can, I told Stephen, feeling funny about talking to a cat about drugs when I wasn't exactly abstaining myself. On the other hand, I didn't consider myself addicted. I was mainly smoking as opposed to coking. Topanga was a hippie haven. It was only a few miles from the smoggy Sunset Strip, but it seemed like another world. The counterculture musicians were there in droves. Bruce's place was a log cabin. I went up there with Greg Reeves, who wanted to meet the great bassist. The reunion was sweet. Bruce called me his brother and said how much he missed me. He talked about how beautiful it was to be in a famous rock group. His eyes told me that he was definitely effed up, but somehow I didn't have the heart to get into his drug problem. We were having too much fun, reminiscing about Toronto. Later that night, we went over to Steele's, where we all jammed for hours. Out of respect to Bruce, Greg played guitar, not his normal instrument. Bruce's bass licks were off, but hell, it was only a jam. Next morning, I was woken by a knock on the door. Standing there was Stills and Graham Nash. Why don't we get a little lunch? Great. We went to Stills, Nash, and James. Didn't sound too bad. We ordered carrot juice and soy burgers topped with sprouts. What's on your minds? I asked Stephen and Graham. Music, said Stephen. Always music. I hear you, man. Always thinking of ways to make the band better. Maybe I was right. Maybe Stills and Nash had invited me to lunch to make me an offer. I've heard you and Greg jamming, said Graham. You guys are great. Thanks, man, I said. We wouldn't want to do anything to break up your duo thing, said Stephen. But we were thinking. He hesitated. Thinking what? I asked, convinced he was about to pop the question. Thinking whether you'd be bummed out if we asked Greg to audition to replace Bruce. What? They wanted Greg, not me. You look surprised, said Nash. I am, I said without telling them why. I can understand, said Stephen. You guys are so tight. The burgers arrived. Seeing the Sprouts didn't make me happy. The Stills-Nash offer didn't make me happy. Going with their group would have meant big money, and if they'd put me in the starting lineup, it would have meant fame. It would have also meant stretching their musical boundaries, but why not? Like me, these cats were experimenters. They needed a brother like me. On the other hand, I could see why they didn't want a brother like me. They already had their thing together. They were afraid Bruce would mess up their upcoming big gigs and had to make sure the bass parts were covered. Bruce had been my man. Now Greg was my man. I had love for both these guys, but I also had some jealousy. Sitting there staring at the Sprouts, I made a quick decision. I wouldn't let my jealousy get in the way of helping a friend. Sure, I said. Audition Greg. Greg's the bomb. When I gave Greg the news that night, he couldn't have been cooler. I want to keep our thing together, Rick, he said. Our thing ain't going nowhere, Greg. It will in time. But right now, it's Crosby, Stills, and Nash's time. Those MFs are huge. You'd be crazy not to jump on this. Greg knew I was right. And a few days later, we were at Steven's house for Greg's big moment. We went to the rehearsal room where Dallas Taylor, the group's bad drummer, had set up his traps. All wrapped in one, set up his traps. Okay, Steven sat down at the organ and Graham grabbed his guitar. The organ didn't help following right behind that. But anyway, then David Crosby arrived. It had been a while since I'd seen him, and he greeted me with a big bear hug. I introduced him to Greg. They shook hands before David took out his guitar and began to tune. I'm nervous, man, Greg whispered to me as he broke out his bass. These guys are serious. Please hit that like button if you can do so for us tonight, 4:05 a.m. We appreciate you hanging in there, and we thank you for showing your appreciation, too. Thank you. We got 30 folks watching, 14 likes. You're going to kill it, bro, I said. You're the effing star student of James Jamerson, the king of them all. They started kicking it, and Greg fell into a nice groove. At first, Greg was mainly supporting, nothing fancy. He laid down a solid bottom that felt good. But after a few minutes, he started breaking out his artillery. From Jamerson, he learned that the bass could be melodic as well as percussive. Jamerson was a very free player, not restricted to any written line. He knew how to make the funk fly. Greg had that same gift. It didn't take him long to lay some stuff on their butts they'd never heard before. Greg was bad. There was no doubt, not for a second, that he could cut it. Besides, he had memorized the first Crosby, Stills, and Nash album and knew all the changes better than they did. In the middle of the jam, Stills broke into a broad smile and threw me a vial of pure pharmaceutical cocaine. Thanks, man, was what he said, indicating that Greg had the gig. The blow felt fantastic. Things couldn't possibly get any better, except they did. The door opened and Neil Young walked in. Ricky, he said, great to see you, man. We shot the stuff for a few minutes before Neil took his guitar out of his case and joined the jam. I didn't realize it then, but this was the birth of Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, with Greg Reeves on bass. When I went home to Savelle, she asked how it went. It was beautiful, I said. Greg killed him. He's in. And you're okay with that? Sure. Except I wasn't that sure. I had done my brother a solid, but I have to admit that I also felt left out. Plus, I had lost my bass player. There was no compensation, either monetary or emotional. But on reflection, maybe there was. I had learned that I could be selfless. That was something new. I could help someone without demanding anything for myself. Even in the cutthroat music biz, there was room for kindness. Norman Whitfield, thought to be a killer competitor himself, had taken the time to school me. So why couldn't I take the time to help a good guy like Greg? I could, and did. And although I was still broke, I felt better about myself when I called Mom, the only person in the world whom I could be completely honest, with whom I could be completely honest, and told her the story. She said, "I couldn't be prouder of you, son. Didn't I say that you have a heart of gold?" I felt the glow washing all over me. The long summer of '69 seemed like it would never end. Greg moved out to go off with the group to be known as Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. The first album he recorded with the group, Deja Vu, was a brilliant classic. Poco continued to gain popularity. Rumors were going around that Billy Preston, who I knew from the R&B circuit, yes, Billy Preston, was cutting tracks with the Beatles in London. The Stones were working on Let It Bleed. It was all cool. It was all interesting. It was all something I felt connected to, and yet the connection never really worked. My plan to break into the big time through the world of white rock and roll hadn't happened. I always thought that if Hendrix, who went from straight up R&B to white rock, could do it, why not me? We were both black hippies. Naturally, I wasn't a guitar genius like Hendrix, but like Jimmy, I wasn't an innovator. I was an innovator. I felt like I could lead the world in new musical directions. And yet there I was, living on Alta Loma with my thumb up my... Maybe it was my anger or resentment of my exclusion from white rock that got me to fall so easily with a light-skinned black cat I'll call Mike the Mac. Mike was a Mac daddy from Chicago, a serious gangster who lived in a mansion on Mulholland with a bevy of gorgeous white women. He wore a black leather cowboy hat, red leather pants, and rhinestone-encrusted high platform shoes. He wore gold chains around his neck and diamond rings on both hands. He reminded me of the baddest cats I knew back in Buffalo, the brothers with the coins to compete with the mafia dons who had employed Mom as a numbers runner. Mike the Mac liked me, and I liked the FU white world attitude he represented. He'd built his own empire on his own terms. Sometimes he'd have me up to his palatial pad just to hear me sing. He bought me a guitar, bass, and electro piano just because he got a kick out of watching me play all the instruments. His instruments were coke, smack, and counterfeit money. Knowing that my money was funny, he'd throw me $1,000 now and then. He threw me $1,000 now and then to keep me in Seville in groceries. While in Mike's company, I also had free access to anything in the drugstore. At this point in my life, my thing was mainly weed. I dug coke, but not to the point of excess, and heroin was off my menu completely. I was Mike the Mac's music man, the entertainment at his all crazy parties. It should be at all his crazy parties. He trusted me completely. When he went off on a 3-week business trip, he asked me to hold a large quantity of blow and heroin. "Don't sample any," he said. "It's all promised to a customer who will be in LA when I return." Being a fool, I sampled some of the coke and sold some of the... Being a fool, I sampled some of the coke and sold some of the H to musician friends. I knew that was wrong, but he needed the money. Mike got back and saw that I chiseled some of his drugs, but didn't say anything. I was relieved. I thought we were still cool. With that in mind, I called Mike when my weed dealer, Junior, said there was a pot drought in LA and he desperately needed a major shipment. Mike, with his access to major suppliers, said it was no problem. Junior agreed to the $10,000. I was at Junior's house when Mike came over with the packages neatly wrapped up in cellophane. He gave us sample joints, and man, after one hit, I knew that stuff was the sure enough bomb. Junior forked over the 10 G's. Mike thanked us and left. Turned out that 5 of the packages contained grass. Not get you high grass, but mow the long grass. Mike had ripped off Junior for $5,000. approximately the dollar amount of the coke and heroin I chiseled from Mike. Drug Lord Justice. Junior wanted to go after Mike, but I convinced him that this was one drug lord he didn't want to mess with. With Mike out of the picture, I had to shift gears. Fortunately, there were other party scenes where I was still welcome. The most welcoming of all was J.C. Brings. In my early California adventures, Jay was probably my most loyal and supportive friend. He loved Seville's home cooking and would often come over for dinner. He never needed an invitation and never failed to leave us with a little weed or cash to cover that month's rent. He was a cat you could talk to, a big-time music lover and a super hip patron of the arts. One early afternoon, Jay came over. I was still asleep. Seville woke me. I was glad to see Jay, but was nursing a wicked hangover. Jay was in a great mood and wanted to take me and Seville to Roman Polanski's crib, where the actress Sharon Tate was living. There was going to be a big party, and Jay didn't want us to miss it. Sharon Tate had once been Jay's girl. Even after Sharon married Polanski, who'd just done Rosemary's Baby, she and Jay stayed friends. Polanski had rented a huge house on CeeLo Drive in Benedict Canyon that Jay said was incredible. You and Seville would love it, he said. There's a pool and a guest house and lofts and fireplaces made of stone. It's at the end of a cul-de-sac and completely private. Cary Grant used to live there. I'd gotten wasted the night before and couldn't think about partying, at least not at that moment. I can't move, Jay, I said. You gotta come, Rick. You'll have a ball. I know I will, but let me catch up with you later. Just leave the address. On a piece of paper, Jay wrote down 10050 CeeLo Drive. He also made me a little map showing how to get there. I immediately fell back to sleep. When I woke up, Seville mentioned Jay's party. She really wanted to make the scene. I did too, but my temples were throbbing. Usually a couple of aspirins are all I needed. In this case, though, the headache wouldn't go away. In those days, it took a lot for me to pass up a party, especially one with Jay bringing sin. Okay. But hard as I tried, I couldn't get myself to make the trek. Come on, Rick, Seville kept urging. Jay always hangs out with the grooviest people. Seville was right. It would be a cool scene at a mellow time. I started to put on some party clothes when, out of nowhere, the headache returned with a vengeance and knocked me on my tail. I could hardly move. Sorry, baby, I told Seville. Something weird's happening. Maybe this is what they call a migraine. Whatever it is, I need to lie down. I fell into bed and closed my eyes, and when I woke up, it was morning. Here, my memory gets fuzzy. I can't remember whether it was the next morning or the morning after. When I went out to the grocery store to pick up some coffees and milk, I happened to glance down at a vending machine selling the Los Angeles Times. The headline read, "Sharon Tate, 4 others murdered." My heart stopped. I fumbled around and finally found the right change to buy the paper. My eyes read the word, but my brains couldn't comprehend what it said. 5 people have been killed in what was being called a ritualistic slaying. They were Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, Abigail Folger, heiress to the coffee fortune, Folger's Coffee. Wow. I don't ever remember hearing that before. Wojtek Frykowski, a filmmaker friend of Roman Polanski, Stephen Parent, and J.C. Bring, former fiancé to Sharon Tate and Hollywood hair product mogul. Wow. I stood there and read it again, and then again, hoping that somehow if I kept reading, the words would change, the names would change, and the story would disappear. But it didn't. Later that day, more details came in over the television. The one that hit me the hardest was that Jay had been found dead with a rope around his neck. He was stabbed 7 times. On the door of the house, the murderers had written "pig" in blood. I was freaked the F out. I was devastated that my good friend had been killed in cold blood. I also couldn't help but think how it could have been me in Seville. We were supposed to be there. Jay come by to get us. Normally, I would have gone in a split second. I loved Hollywood parties. I loved Jay. It was only the headache that stopped me. I couldn't think of what I had done to deserve this kind of break. I couldn't think of what Jay had done to die this kind of brutal death. None of it made any sense. The whole Hollywood community, me included, was scared straight. It got even worse when the next night two other people, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, were slaughtered in their home in Los Feliz, a neighborhood right next to Hollywood. The killer carved "war" on Leno's stomach. The words "death to pigs" were written in blood on the wall. That was supposed to be some tactics to cause investigators to think it was black militants who had done the murders, to say "death to pigs." Anyway, because this was a time when everyone was smoking tons of weed, a substance that sure as hell feeds paranoia, we were out of our minds with fear. Who knew who these killers were? We ran out and got heavier locks for our doors and barred the windows. In my case, I got me a piece. I wasn't taking no chances. If some crazed killer showed up at our crib, I'd blow him away. I resorted to calling my mother every night. She was the most comforting thing in my life. When I told her the story of how I was almost with Jay that night, she was quick to say, "God spared your life for a reason." Maybe so, Mom, but I gotta say I'm scared. Who wouldn't be, James? It was a horrible, frightening thing that happened. I want to come home. I'm not sure this is the time. Why not? Well, you haven't done what you set out to do. You were going to start a band, weren't you? I was, but I got sidetracked. Steven Stills hired Greg Reeves away from me. Greg and I were going to be salt and pepper. I'm sure Greg's great, said Mom, but I know there are a lot of other musicians you can work with. There are, but right now I'm not too hip on running these streets to look for musicians. The streets out here are full of killers gone crazy. Killers are everywhere, James. You grew up in a city where there were killings all the time. It's difficult here, Mom. The crazies are crazier. They cut up people and use their blood to write secret messages. They got messages on the walls and on the sidewalks. They're looking for their next victim. I think they've targeted musicians. You sound like you've been smoking too much. Mom knew me, and I loved her too much to lie. I'm trying to cut back, I said. Try to get yourself together, son. You owe it to yourself to develop your talent. Stop smoking them funny cigarettes and start making music. Mom always had the last and best word. I knew she was right. As scary as it was to stay in L.A. that summer of slaughter, I remained where I was. A week after the bloody murders, Woodstock went down in upstate New York. I watched the TV report saying that 500,000 hippies had made the scene. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young were on the bill. The biggest act of all, Jimi Hendrix, closed the festival. Watching the news clips, I asked myself why I wasn't up there. These were my peers. I heard what they were doing and knew I could do it as well or better. I saw how they were dressing, and I knew I had just as much style, if not more. I'm not taking anything away from Janis Joplin or Sly Stone or The Who or The Grateful Dead. They were all bad. They all had their own sound and their original songs, but so do I. Yet they had found a way to get themselves out there in front of, you know, whatever issue it is, in front of the hippie nation while I was still farting around in my little apartment. I hadn't become a hippie act like Santana or Country Joe and the Fish, and I hadn't become a soul music act like Aretha Franklin or Wilson Pickett. I had fallen in the cracks of the two worlds of pop music, black and white, knowing that I could do both those styles with originality and skill. Why hadn't I done what I'd set out to do? Mom had the answer. I was stoned all the time. I was too through to take care of business. I had to throw out the weed, flush the blow down the toilet, pour out the wine and the whiskey, and concentrate on what God had saved me to do. Write songs, sing songs, be an artist. The only thing that was getting in my way was fear. I had to defeat the fear. Fear's defeat happened in a strange way. I was eating a hot dog at Orange Julius on Santa Monica Barbecue when these fine chicks came and handed me a piece of paper about chanting. I talked about how chanting relieves stress and lifts fear. I'd never heard that before. If the chicks hadn't been so fine, I might not have paid them much attention to their solicitation, but I did. I kept the paper. The next day, drove to the address on it in Beverly Hills to see what chanting was all about. I learned it was a Buddhist thing. Cool. Buddhism was a peaceful religion. Buddhism might help me cut back on the stimulus that had been exciting my fears. In that room, the vibe was not fearful. Everyone sat on Persian rugs. The leader faced the rest of us in lotus position. We were to close our eyes and become conscious of our breath. We were told to let our thoughts go, simply let them pass on. We were told not to hold on to anything but simply follow for our breath. And then we were told to chant. The chant was more of a sound than a word. The sound had a resonance that I liked. It helped me move from my thoughts and stay in my body. After a while, I felt myself leaving my body. I looked back at my body from a place I had never experienced before. I felt outside time and space. It just was. Chanting went on and on. I can't say for how long. Maybe it's an hour, maybe two. When the session was over, the leader looked at me and put his hands together as if in prayer. He nodded and smiled. I felt changed. I felt motivated. My relationship with Seville, which had been rocky because of all my drugs, got better. I got more focused on music. I started writing and singing. My lyrics got deeper and my voice got stronger. I went into the clubs and looked for talent. I couldn't Greg Reeves, who was married to Crosby, Stills, and Nash, but I was going to resurrect Salt and Pepper anyway. First cat I found was Eddie Roth, who out of the Hammond B3. Wasn't nothing Eddie couldn't play. Any groove, any genre. Plus he blew good as Herbie Mann. Second cat was David Burke on guitar. Think John McLaughlin and Al Di Meola. Then multiply times two and the result is Burke. Rock and jazz were coming together back then, and Burke was the guy who blended them to perfection. My drummer was Coffee Hall. Because I'm a drummer, I'm a hard critic on any percussionist. But there was nothing to criticize about Coffee. He could backstick on a bottle cap and do fancy rolls with one finger. Amazing chops. Fourth member was Chris Sarnes on bass, who was simpler than Jameson Reeves, but just as earthy. He provided that big rock bottom every group needs. His forte was simplicity. Sarnes' thing was to keep it hot. Sarnes' thing was to keep it hot, funky, and anchored to the earth. It was all about musical virtuosity. These boys could blow as bad as anyone on either coast. Tapering off drugs, not entirely, but doing away. Okay. 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 It was all about musical virtuosity. These boys could blow as bad as anyone on either coast. Tapering off drugs, not entirely, but doing way less than before. I got my voice in great shape. The chanting helped, I bet. I was writing all kinds of original material on all sorts of subjects. I had a song called Alice in Ghetto Land. Alice in Wonderland used for mind control programming, and Alice in Wonderland imagery is used for mind control programming. Snoop had one called something, I forget his, but you will find artists play off this theme many times, either the theme of Alice in Wonderland or the theme of the Wizard of Oz, like you saw at the movie The Wiz. Okay, it says, I had a song called Alice in Ghetto Land where instead of falling down the rabbit hole, Alice falls into a trash can and winds up on the chocolate side of town, dealing with gangsters and pimps. Another called Train Song had elements of Curtis Mayfield's People Get Ready, a song about racial harmony. I was open to all the musical currents flowing through the country. Taj Mahal was making a splash with his hip retro country blues. It was Taj who introduced me to do Willie Dixon's I Just Want to Make Love to You through a heavy psychedelic filter. Yes, along with Led Zeppelin. Oh, yes. The group called Yes. Yes, along with Led Zeppelin, was being called the next big thing in rock coming over from England. Yes, it made a big splash with their debut Atlantic album. And when Salt and Pepper were booked to open for them at the Whiskey, it was a big effing deal. We were pumped. Yes was a progressive rock band, but we knew no one was more progressive this is the one than us. We rehearsed like madmen. On opening night, in spite of all the anticipation for Yes, the audience wouldn't let us go. We did 4 encores. We blew off the roof and made Yes work like MFers to come up to our level. During that week, Yes guitarist Stevie Howe was asking my guitarist David Burke for pointers. Yes, drummer Bill Bruford was taking lessons from my drummer, Coffee Hall. When Norman Whitfield came by to see us, he said, "Rick, I'm glad I chased you out of Detroit. This band is serious. This band is going to worry Hendrix. It's going to worry everyone else. It's going to worry everyone." Neil Young dropped by and heard me play his Cinnamon Girl. I twisted that song into a shape Neil had never imagined. He loved it. "You got to meet my manager," he said. Enter Elliot Roberts. At the time, Elliot was a super manager, flying high with Joni Mitchell and Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Roberts heard us and signed us. I knew this was the break I'd been waiting for. I had a killer band and now a killer manager. Everything was in place except it wasn't. We couldn't get Elliot's attention. He had bigger fish to fry. Later I learned he was chasing after the Eagles. Whatever it was, we were neglected. When I confronted him, though, he was cool. I think Salt and Pepper. When I confronted him, though, he was cool. "I think Salt and Pepper's fantastic," he said, "but I just don't have the time. Let me get Bill Graham to help you." Roberts came through. Enter the great Bill Graham. He heard us. Okay. He heard us, loved us, and booked us in his club, the Fillmore West, where we opened for Jethro Tull. We were finally in the middle of the mix. This was the big time. The start of a new decade, the 70s, and the start of a new career for me. I was fronting what I knew I had to be the next big Iron Sheik, but hopefully it'll be gone by then. The start of a new decade. Have mercy. Okay. The start of a new decade, the 70s, and the start of a new career for me. I was fronting what I knew had to be the next big thing in rock, soul and funk. I had it all together. When Bill had us open for Chicago, the Allman Brothers and Boz Scaggs, all those cats gave us props. Even though we didn't have a record deal, it couldn't be long. It wasn't. Enter Phil Walden, the guy who'd made Otis Redding and then managed the Allman Brothers. Walden said he'd put us on Atlantic Records, and that's what he did. The label of Ray Charles, Solomon Burke, Wilson Pickett, Simon Dave, Aretha Franklin, not to mention Yes and Led Zeppelin. Atlantic was just where I wanted to be. Soon I saw myself crossing and busting up England the way I was about to bust up America. Contracts came through, and next thing I knew, Tom Dowd, the famous Atlantic engineer who'd become a producer, came to check us out. He wanted to assess our sound. The word looked at Dowd as a genius, but I didn't. He made a few suggestions that I thought were BS. He talked about dynamics, but hell, Salt and Pepper was the most dynamic band going. Not wanting to F up the deal, I pretended to take him seriously. Atlanta sent us plane tickets to fly to Miami and cut our first record, which Dowd would produce. I wanted Mom to be there. "Can't come in for it, son," she said. "Too busy here." You can stop running those numbers now, I told her. This record we're about to make is going to be the bomb. You can kiss your money problems goodbye. Ain't got no money problems, James. That's because I keep on working. Anyway, I'm proud of what you're doing, and I know this thing is going to be a success. It wasn't. I was happy to go back to Criteria Studios where I had freelanced before, but Miami was the pits. Atlantic was the pits. They rented us a house with no air conditioner in the middle of a blistering summer heat wave. They didn't get us the equipment we needed for the studio, and when I called to complain, they said that the boss, Jerry Wexler, had to approve it all and couldn't be reached. He was on his yacht. Our manager, Phil Walden, was suddenly hard to get. We were told our advance was sent to him, and yet we hadn't seen a dime. Phil kept ducking my calls. The studio still wasn't ready, and the scorching heat got hotter. Whoever I tried reaching, Dowd, Wexler, or Walden, was in meetings or had gone fishing. When I finally got a mid-level executive at Atlantic, I said, "Does the label want us to make a doggone record or not?" "Can I get back to you on that?" the guy asked. I hung up in his ear. I looked out on the ocean. I thought of the expression, water, water everywhere, not any drop to drink. The ocean was the music business. Everyone I knew was in a ship that had left port. Everyone was sailing over a smooth sea. Meanwhile, I was drowning on dry land. I was out of patience and out of ideas. I went back to L.A. I was back in L.A. without a nickel to my name. And the next chapter will be Mother Earth. Mother Earth is the next chapter. Take note of that. And I thank you 31 folks for hanging in there with us tonight. I know that it's awful late. And so I'm not going to keep folks at all, okay? We're going to play one song and end the show, okay? So I love you all. Thank you all for coming. Oops. Let me see. Let me see. All right. Well, I appreciate you, V. Okay, and let us go out. Let us go out like this. Yeah, let's go out like this. I'm so glad you enjoyed it, Sister Vanette. I love you too, Big Nephew Drew. And you're welcome, Sister Becky Reynolds, and welcome to you. Some of a little length to it. Yeah, let's do this. Right on. Oh no, Mike Jr. say one more. Oh no, I gotta go, gotta go. Gotta go, gotta go. Gotta go right now. But yeah, look for a special guest. No. Look for a special reading to go along with our 7/7 broadcast, which will more than likely be tomorrow. If it's not tomorrow, again, please forgive me. I try to fit in everything and make sure that everyone is served. I really do. Okay, but if not tomorrow, you can look for me Tuesday or on Wednesday's show. We're going to focus on 7/7, and we're going to have a reading. Just because I'm ready to see what it say. We're going to have a reading. And you're going to put some respect on her name. And that'll be a bonus show. Look for a lot of bonus shows between now and then, okay? So love y'all. Shalom.
Oh, he is my I don't care what you think about me, I'm gonna pray for peace. And I don't care what you say about me, I'm gonna pray for love. And I don't care what you say about me, I'm gonna ask for understanding. I don't care what you think about me, I need God from above. And I know that prayer will make everything alright. When there seems to be no other way, I'm gonna fall down on my knees and pray. Let's say that again. I don't care what you think about me, I'm gonna pray for peace. And I don't care what you say about me, I'm gonna pray for love. And I don't care what you think about me, I'm gonna ask for understanding. I don't care what you say about me, I need love from above. And I know everything will be alright.